This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Okay, Bruchim Haba, welcome everyone, Shalom Aleichem. We have a very important and interesting subject this evening, and we're going to speak about a topic which is Nageya, not only the Parsha, but it's also Nageya, the Zman of the year, which is the 3 weeks, the Bein HaMetzarim, the Dry Vachen, and we're going to speak about Mamish Dvarim Ha'imdim Beruma Shel Olam. So if you came just for this shiur, you picked the right shiur. The Avodas Yisrael, the Kashan Tzemagid tells us, everyone have Mar Mekoimos? Yeah, you have? You give me that? Okay, shkoyach. Kashan Tzemagid teaches us that Parshas Masei always comes out during the Bein HaMetzarim. In other words, there are other Parshas, Pinchas, it's usually, but it could be hit or miss. But Masei always comes out during the, it's impossible not to. Devarim is Chazoin, and Masei is already the second week of the 3 weeks. So what's the connection between Parshas Masei and the 3 weeks? So the Kashan Tzemagid says an amazing thing. What do we read in this parsha? We read about the Membeis Masois, the 42 trips and travails that Klal Yisrael had to endure in the Midbar before they got into Eretz Yisrael. But likewise, every year, we so to speak have to endure 42 stops and 42 destinations before we also get, so to speak, to the Promised Land. Because Tisha B'Av, Al Pi the Medrash, is the birth of Mashiach. And in order to, the same way before they got into Eretz Yisrael, they had to travel 42 Masais, so too, we also have 42 segments of time before we arrive at Tisha B'Av. And that is, what do you mean 42? Says the Kashan Tzemagid. We know how much time is in the 3 weeks, 21 days, but the 21 days consists of 21 daytime hours and 21 nighttime hours. So therefore, says the Kashan Tzemagid, the same way in order to get into Eretz Yisrael, we went through 42 Masais, so too, in order to experience the 3 weeks fully and completely, we go through 42 segments of time because the 3 weeks is 21 days. What? No, but there's 21 daytimes and 21 night times. That's his cheshbon. His cheshbon is the same way, there are 42 masois, so there are 21 day segments and 21 night segments, a total of 42 segments until Tisha B'Av. Now, how do we know that there are 21 days in the 3 weeks? So you'll ask, what do you mean, how do we know? I mean, it's 3 weeks. 3 weeks is 21 days. But the answer is, l'chayra, there aren't 21 days in the 3 weeks. And the whole concept of 3 weeks would seem to be a misnomer. Because this year, Shavas B'Tammuz is on a Thursday, so Tisha B'Av is a Thursday, so there are really 22 days. There are always 22 days in the 3 weeks. They're not 21 days. In fact, all the Ramazim in the Bnei Yissaschar is, he says, how many hours in the 3 weeks? 22 times 24, Gematria 428, there are 428 hours, Keneged, the number of Prakim and Shas. So, Al Pi Svara, there are really 22 days in the 3 weeks, and yet we're going to see in all the Sifrei Drush, they always talk about the 21 days. For example, in last week's Haftarah, in the beginning of the Navi Yirmiyah, Perek Aleph, Pasuk Yud Aleph, Vayid Var Hashem Elai Leimar Mataroya. Yirmiyahu, the Rebbe Shem comes to Yirmiyah, he says, Jeremiah, what do you see? Vayimar, Yirmiyah says, Makel Shaked Ani Roya, I see an almond stick. That's the famous vision of Yirmiyah. That's the first nevuah of Yirmiyah. So Rashi says, what was the significance of the almond stick? Says Rashi, the almond stick was, so to speak, the first staff, is the quickest blossoming fruit. In other words, if you plant an apple tree, it takes time. If you plant a pear tree, it takes time. But the almond is the quickest blossoming fruit. That's why it's called shaked. Shaked means it's diligent. It hastens to blossom. So too what the Rebbe Shem was saying is, I will hasten to bring the perennials. It's not in the far off future, but it's coming very, very soon. But then Rashi brings the Medrash Haggadah. And the Medrash Haggadah, Rashi says that there is a specific connection between the almond and the Zman perennials. And that is, says Rashi, just like it takes 21 days from the time that the almond tree is blossoms until it is ripe, meaning the ripening period of the almond is 21 days, so too the period of perennials is 21 days. So again we see, Rashi is saying very clearly that the period of perennials is not 22 days, but rather it's 21 days. It's interesting, if you look in the Gemara in Bechairos, the famous Gemara about the Chachmei Atuna, the sages of Athens, who debated Rabbi Shiur ben Chananya. So it says over there that one of the questions they asked Rabbi Shiur ben Chananya, you have two chickens, and one chicken, the one is black, and one is white. Both, by the way, both of their lives matter very much, because you can eat both of them, it doesn't matter what color, right? So, and they both give birth to an egg, and they both give birth to white eggs. And this was one of the philosophical questions they asked Rabbi Shiur ben Chananya. How is it shaykh that a black chicken and a white chicken both give birth to white eggs? So the Maharsha says, well, what was the big chachma de kasha? The Maharsha says the question is, it takes 21 days for the egg to incubate. Likewise, says the Maharsha, we have 2 periods of the year of 21 days. We have 21 days of Rachamim and Tishrei, from Rosh Hashanah until Hoshana Rabbah, and we have 21 days of Din from Shavuos Tammuz to Tisha B'Av. So again, we see this inyan that there are 21 days. In fact, the Arizal on the Sha'ar Kavanos, he writes, what's the inyan of Bein HaMetzarim? Says the Ari, it's Chaf Aleph Yomim between Shavuos Tammuz and Tisha B'Av. So again, we see consistently, Chazal always talk about this man as 21 days. Why would that be? What happened to the 22nd day? For some reason, they're not counting Tisha B'Av. Maybe because Tisha B'Av, the Shulchan Aruch says it's called a Moyed, as it says in Eicha. We don't say Tafnon on Tisha B'Av. So, but there's this concept that there are 21 days of the Bein HaMetzarim. So you have 21 day segments, 21 night segments, a total of 42 membeis, and somehow this is alluded to in the 42 stops that the Bnei Yisrael made in Parshas Masei. What exactly is the connection between the 42 stops in Parshas Masei and the 42 segments of time in Parshas during the 3 weeks? So we come to the beginning of Parshas Masei. If you look at number 6, the pasuk says, Eile, everyone have sheets? You have the right sheets? Eile Masei Bnei Yisrael asher yatzu me'eretz Mitzrayim letzavaisam v'yad Moshe v'Aaron. These are the trips of Bnei Yisrael that they went out of Mitzrayim in the hands of Moshe and Aaron. Vayichtov Moshe wrote es moitza'eim, their goings out, l'maseim, by their travels, al pi Hashem, ve'ela maseihem l'moitza'ehem. And these are the trips according to their goings out. So it's very interesting. The pasuk is repetitive, yeah? The pasuk first says moitza'ehem l'maseihem, and then it says maseihem l'moitza'ehem. So the first thing Rashi wants to know is, why do I need to know all these trips? I remember my Zayda Zolgazunzain, he came to America in 1951. He was liberated on Lag BaOmer, 1945, from Dachau. And he worked in the DP camps for many years. He helped the Yidden rebuild their lives and come to America, come to Eretz Yisrael. And he got a job in America as a rabbi in 1951 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And that's where he lived from 1951 until a few years ago. So when my grandmother, Lela Sham, was alive, we used to go to Pittsburgh. Now imagine if I wrote a book. Glatstein came out with a new sefer. What's the book about? All the stops he made going to Pittsburgh. He stopped in Harrisburg, he stopped in Carlisle, he stopped in Allegheny, right? If anybody would buy that book, they would need to be institutionalized. Why in the world would anybody care where people made stops? I mean, that's the most empty, trivial piece of information. Do you write a book when you go to Lakewood? When I went to Lakewood, I stopped by, what's it called? What's the name of the stop? Stratford? Slowsburg. Shkoyach. So you and the rest of the world stopped and you bought Mountain Dew. Very nice. You're not going to write a book about that. Nobody writes a book where they stop. Every rest stop is exactly the same. So why do we need to know the stops? Especially, Rabbi say, if you've been paying attention a little bit, you would be able to know and list off all the stops. Why does the Torah have to record all of the stops? So Rashi says a very interesting thing. Says Rashi, even though the Bnei Yisrael made 42 stops. So you would think Hashem made a decree on them that they should be metaltel and lahaniyim, they'd be shaken up and they'd be moving around. It would seem to be a very harsh gezerah. But if you think about it, in 40 years, they only made 42 stops. That's nothing. Most people on the way to the country, they stop 42 times. I mean, people, they drive to Lakewood, they could stop 28 times on the way, Just so if you add up the number of stops Klal Yisrael made, it really doesn't amount to that much, especially, says Rashi, 14 of the stops they made in the Shana Rishona before the Gezerah. 8 of the stops they made in the 40th year when the Gezerah was over. So in total, they only made 20 stops in the whole 38 years. That's nothing. Many people, they go from one place to another. Every year they move somewhere else. So Rashi is saying, it's teaching me the chesed of the Rebbeinu Shalom, that even though the Rebbeinu Shalom made a decree that they would be matotol, in the Midbar they made very few stops. But why did Yirmiyah have the information of the Gullus? He was the prophet of doom and gloom. He was the Navi in the time of the Chorban. Yirmiyah was born on Tisha B'Av. He cursed the day of his birth. Yirmiyah was the prophet of Peranios. Why him? There are deep reasons, but that's beyond the scope of today's shiur. Well, who is it? The Gogo of a PowerPoint or something? Yeah. So, but be it as it may, Marvar Aboisai, these are the 42 stops that Klal Yisrael made in the Midbar. Now, very interesting. Comes Rav David Pardo, and I completely forgot about this. This year, when I was in Eretz Yisrael on Har HaZeisim, I found the kever of Rav David Pardo. Rav David Pardo was one of the classic commentaries on Rashi. He wrote something called the Maskil LeDavid. He also wrote a commentary on the Tosefta, I believe, called Chastei David. And he has a kasha. Because he says if you count up the Masois, you only have 41 Masois, unless you count Ramses. So Ramses, L'chayra, was not a destination. Ramses was their point of departure. So Ramses was not a travel. They didn't go to Ramses. They left Mitzrayim from Ramses. So why would Ramses be counted? So Rav David Pardo says an interesting thing that we know. Rashi tells us that when it came time to leave Mitzrayim, Hashem had to, so to speak, gather all of Klal Yisrael from all over Ramses to consolidate them into one area, and they left from there. So therefore, since Klal Yisrael were not centrally located in Ramses, but they had to be collected to Ramses in one location, that was the 42nd Masa, or the first Masa, meaning that makes the list. Okay, Marav Rabbi, we begin tonight's shiur. Fasten your seatbelts. The 42 Masais. Mamish, this is Dvarim Ha'imdim Berumah Shalaylam. Because if you think about it, this is really the last subject of the Torah. This Shabbos is really Simchas Torah. So why could be Simchas Torah? I'm in a bad mood. It's Bein HaMitzorim. I have to wear masks. I don't have to wear masks. Bad news every day. It's Yimei Peranios. I can't take it. No, you should know this week is Simchas Torah. How is it Simchas Torah? We're finishing the Torah this week. Because next week is Devarim, is Mishnah Torah. Mishnah Torah doesn't count. You know the first Tosfos in Gittin? Tosfos in Gittin says that a get has how many lines? 12 lines. Keneged the spaces between Bereshis and Shemais, Shemais and Vayikra, Vayikra and Bamidbar. And not between Bamidbar and Devarim, because Devarim doesn't count, because Devarim is just the Chazara. So there's a concept that Devarim is, in a way, not part of the, it is, but it isn't. So says the Tzur Hamar, in effect, Masei is the end of the Torah. And how does the Torah end? With seemingly information that seems to us at first glance as useless information. Why in the world do I need to know the 42 stops? Imagine if I came. Okay, Shalom Aleichem, welcome to the shiur. Where are you coming from? Williamsburg, I heard of it. Imagine if you came in and you said, Glatstein, here's a paper. It says all the red lights that we stop by on the way to the shiur. Okay, well, why would anybody want to know that? Here I'm submitting. That's what the Torah is doing. Here are the 42 sand dunes in the desert that Klal Yisrael stopped by. Who cares? And not only that, that's the end of the Torah. The Torah ends with information that we have absolutely no understanding of. And if you would have been reading the Torah until now, you would have been able to record these 42 places. Why list as the conclusion of Kol HaTorah Kula the 42 stops? Says the Tzar Amar Rabbi Avram Saba. Rabbi Avram Saba was one of the Gerushei Sfarad. He was exiled from Spain in 1492. He lived a very tragic life. All of his manuscripts were taken away. He never saw them again. He wrote a Parshas on the whole Chumash, and on a few of the Megillas they were taken away. He had to bury them lest they be confiscated. He wrote his entire Perush over from memory. He had two boys. They were both forcibly kidnapped in Portugal and baptized. He never saw them again. Rabbi Avram Saba. Rabbi Avram Saba, the author of the Torah. There was a little bit of a happy ending, because his granddaughter, if I'm not mistaken, married the Beis Yosef. But think about the tragedy. Somebody spends their whole life working on a project, Kedushim Noiraim, and then done. So imagine the tsar of someone, two boys forcibly kidnapped and baptized. By the way, the gezerah in Portugal was every single child was taken and baptized. It's not like in Russia, some of the boys were drafted into the Russian army. Every single child was kidnapped and baptized. So Rabbi Avram Saba rewrote his commentary from memory. And in his forum, he records a lot of the biographical information about his being kicked out of Spain in 1492. And he points out that even though it would seem to us trivial information, the Torah makes sure to write to Hashem. The bunch from specifically designated these 42 stops, and once these 42 stops to be recorded. Why? For us to realize that obviously, if it seems empty, it's empty for us. Davar Reiku, Reiku Ken. It's empty from you. You're the one who's empty. But obviously there's very great meaning. In other words, the Torah ends on the following way. The Torah wants for you to know every detail, every little word, every small prat of the Torah is laden with tremendous, tremendous meaning, because the Rebbe Hashem chose to end off the Torah with information that we look at and we say we don't understand it, but it's al pi Hashem. So if even something that we have no understanding of, we have to recognize it's al pi Hashem, then the things that we begin to recognize, certainly we have to understand and extrapolate they're for sure al pi Hashem. Because whatever the Torah ends with has to be like a bang, has to be a very fundamental principle. So the Torah ends by giving seemingly empty information, writing that it's al pi Hashem, so that you can recognize if this is al pi Hashem, certainly everything in the Torah is al pi Hashem. Similar, says the Torah Mark, to the way the Nevi'im end. How does the Nevi'im end? Zichru Torahs Moshe Achu. Remember to keep the Torah. Why do the Nevi'im end this way? So says the Tzadikan. Very important. Because Hashem knows there's going to be a guy who gets up one day who has a Jewish mother, and he probably had a Jewish father also, but the mother was smart enough to say Nisabra Me'ashina, and this mamzer is going to come along and say you don't have to keep the law, just believe in me. So the last word of the Nevi'im is keep the Torah, because a guy is going to come a little bit later and claim he's a Navi, and that you don't have to keep the Torah. So the last word is the most important message. Never abrogate the law. That's the famous Yisrael, Reb Sadi Goyim. So too says the Torah Amar. The Torah ends with Masais that we have no understanding of, and yet it says Al Pi Hashem to recognize if this is Al Pi Hashem, everything's Al Pi Hashem. But then Rabbi Avram Saba drops the bombshell of the night. He says these 42 Masais correspond to the 42 letter name of Hashem. Hashem has a name that's 42 letters. And that name is Aleph, Beis, followed by a Gimel, followed by a Yud, followed by a Taf, followed by a Tzadi. We're in number 9 in the third paragraph, second line. And these 42 letters are alluded to in the first 42 letters of the Chumash. From Bereshis until the V's of Vavayu are 42 letters. Those 42 letters are the 42 letters with which Hashem created the world. And the first 42 letters of the Torah correspond to the 42 letter name of Hashem. Now this 42 letter name of Hashem has 7 words in it. Each word corresponds to another day of the week. So the first day of the week is Aleph Beis, followed by a Gimel Yud, followed by a Taf Tzadi. So the 42 letter name of Hashem has 7 words. Each word has 6 letters. Name 1 is the name with which God created the first day of creation. The second name is Karas Satan. God created day 2 with Karas Satan. Why? Because Gehenna was created on day 2. Says the Shor Hamar, Oyoim V'Noira, there's a pasuk in Tehillim, Hashem Bam, God is Bam, Beis Mem 42, to be Merames, Hashem created the world with the 42 letter name. And furthermore he says, this is also Merumaz in Hashem Echad. He doesn't explain. I think what he means is Hashem is Yud-Kei Vav-Kei 26, Echad is 13, so that's 39, plus the 2 words is 41, plus the Kailel is 42. So I think that's what he means. Hashem Echad is 42. L'chayra, that's what he means. And Hashem, so now when you look at the Torah is very different now. Because that means the Torah begins with 42 letters. Those are the 42 letters with which Hashem created the world. And how does the Torah end in Parshas Masei? With the 42 destinations. So the Torah begins and ends with the Shem Mem Beis. You know, the Torah is what is called Na'otz Soifa L'Tchilasa. Or in French they say the Torah is Geknippt und Gebinder. In Cedarhurst they don't understand French, but in other places they know it, right? The Torah is Na'otz Soifa L'Tchilasa. The Torah begins 42, the Torah ends 42. And I'll tell you an amazing thing. Today was the yahrzeit of who? One of the great old-time Mekubalim, the Moshe Cordovera. Right? Ramak. So I looked in the Siddur of the Ramak, and I just happened to see. I wasn't looking for the Shiur, I was looking to say something for the Talmud Devarah Shiur. And he says by Shema, how many words are in the first Parsha of Shema? We said in the Purim Shiur many, many times. How many words in the first Parsha of Shema? 54. Keneged the 54 names of Haman in the Megillah, Keneged the 54 letters in the Aseret B'nai Haman, Keneged the 54 words in Bimei Mordechai V'Esther B'Shushan Habira, Machai Emcha is 54. But how do you have 54 words? Because Shema Yisrael Hashem Lekeinu Hashem Echad is 6. Baruch Shem Kavod Malchusai Li'Olam Va'ed is 6 is 12. So taking out Shema and taking out Baruch Shem, how many words do you have in the first Parsha of Shema? 42. Avada. 42 is everywhere. You just have to be aware of it. The Torah begins with 42 letters. The Torah ends with the 42 Masois. And therefore, this is to teach the Torah is never ending. It's an endless circle of Shemois of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's Kuloi Shemois of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's why, from where do we learn out Berachas HaTorah? The Shem Hashem Ekro, when I say the name of Hashem, Havu Goydel Elikim, because the entire Torah are Shemois of Hashem. Then the Tzvar Amar says like this. There's another important Yediyah, and another important factor why the Torah ends with the 42 Masois. And that is to give us great hope for the coming of Mashiach. Why is that? He says that the same way until we got to the Promised Land, until we got to Eretz Yisrael, we had to make 42 stops. It says the Tzvar Amar, Klal Yisrael has to make 42 stops before Mashiach comes. From Bavel to Kazvi, to Paras, to Madai, to Yavan, to Moikdan, to Edom, to Yishmael, to Flatbush, to Williamsburg, to Cedarhurst, right? There are 42 Masois that you have to make. Says the Tzvar Hamar. And we, Spanish Jewry, came from where, Rabbi Sai? That's pretty good, not bad. Give the man a cigar. No, but before. Where did they come from? Yerushalayim. In other words, Eretz Yisrael was exiled to all of Europe, but Jerusalem was specifically exiled to Spain. So where does it say? It's a pasuk in Tanakh. Golos Yerushalayim Asher B'Sfarad. That's why Spanish Jews consider themselves Mamish Malchus Beis David, because the family of David HaMelech was sent to Spain. It's a pasuk in Tanakh. There's no dispute about that. In other words, Spanish Jewry is Shevet Yehuda. The rest of the Shvatim and the rest of Klal, and specifically Malchus Beis David. Golas Yerushalayim Asher B'Sfarad. And from there, they went to Fez, and from there to other lands. So, says it Tzor Hamar, listen to the following. He says, if Klal Yisrael in the Midbar had to go through 42 Masois, he says, do you know how many Masois I had to go through in the last 8 years, since 1492 to the year 1500? At least 1,000 different Makayimais I had to go to, and to suffer through, and to travel through during the 8 years of Golos. But if in the 42 Masois, Klal Yisrael ultimately were redeemed al Yedei from Mitzrayim, al Yedei Moshe ve'Aaron, so too ultimately the Rebbeinu Shalom will redeem us b'yad Mashiach ben David, Mashiach ben Yosef. Okay? Rabbi said this is just a hakdama to today's shiur. Maybe by the end of the shiur, the Siyat Shana will explain what the significance of 42 is. Okay? Now, this Tzor Hamar, surprisingly, you think Tzor Hamar is a Rishon, it's a Perush on Chumash. It's like, it's a Perush. We call it Parshanus, right? There's Lamdus, there's Pshat. The Magen Avram Lehalacha brings down the Tzor Hamar that since the 42 Masois correspond to the 42 name of Hashem, it is Asur Lahafsik when you're leaning between any of the Masois, because it's like being mafsik in the middle of Hashem's name. So even though you're reading Elisa, Risma, Sukkos, Ramses, this place, that place, Wyoming, South Dakota, North Dakota. No. These are names of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. You cannot be Magen Avram brings a halacha. Ein lahafsik b'hem, shuk neged shem member. Says Arizal that what's the significance of the 42 Masois? Klal Yisrael left Mitzrayim with the koyach of the Shem Mem Beis. Klal Yisrael was elevated out of the Midbar with the Shem Mem Beis. In other words, Arizal is teaching us that there's a unique koyach of the Shem Mem Beis that is able to be male us from one matzav to another. In other words, if you want to get from one matzav to another, you're, let's say for example, you're on an elevator and the elevator is not working, the Shem Mem Beis, that's the way to go. That's going to get you from one madrega to the next, and you'll see a few examples of it. Says the Agar de Kala from the Bnei Yissaschar. He says, Eile Masei Bnei Yisrael, Masei Bnei, Rashi Tevois, Mem Beis. These Masois were from the 42 letter name of Hashem. Who conducted these Masois? Who led the Masois? Biyad Moshe. Again, Rashi Tevois, 42. So this significant number, 42, is alluded to in two places in the opening of Parshas Masei. Now, remember the Gemara in Chagiga? We were learning Chagiga recently in Daf HaShavua. And the Mishnah says on Daf Yud from Beis that you cannot darshan Maseh Bereshis with two people. In other words, let's say you wanted to go to a shiur about Maseh Bereshis. You can't do it. You can't talk about Maseh Bereshis in front of too many people already. It's already too many people. Comes Tosfos, and Tosfos says, what does it mean you can't darshan Maseh Bereshis in front of two people? Says Tosfos, it's not that you can't talk about the creation of the world. When we say you can't darshan Maseh Bereshis refers to the 42 letters name of Hashem that's alluded to in the beginning of Bereshis. That's what you can't talk about. You can't publicly speak about the 42 letter name of Hashem. So you say, if you can't speak about it publicly, then what in the world are we doing to them? So that's what Tosfos says. It's just among friends, it's just us. But we have to explain that. Because according to Tosfos, according to Rabbi Natan, when the Mishnah says you're not allowed to talk about Maseh Bereshis in front of one other person, it means you can't talk about the Shem Mem Beis. So we have to explain how we're allowed to do this. In fact, Rabbeinu Bechaye writes that the Shem Mem Beis, we have a tradition, starts from Bereshis, the Vez of Vayhu is the 42nd letter of the Torah. That is the end of the 42 letter name of Hashem, and Arizal says the same thing. Now, the 42 letter name of Hashem, what are the first 6 oisiyos? So we saw earlier in the Tzor Hamar, it's Aleph Beis Gimel, followed by Yud Tes Sadi. Where does that come from? Bereshis, the Beis is a Shin, the Reish is a Beis, the Aleph is a Taf. If you use Atbash, you basically get the first 6 letters, and 2 of the letters are inexplicable. We don't know where it came from. So, very interesting. what exactly are all 42 letters? Do we know what they are? So I'm here to tell you, you heard it here first. The Tikkunei Zayar, and by the way, almost all the Marmakomis of today's Shiur comes from the Sefer Shvilei Pinchas in Tafshin Ayin Gimel, in the Maimar on Parshas Pinchas. And we're going to add one little Haisafa. The Tikkunei Zayar says if you want to know what the 42 letters are, if you look at number 17, here we have them. Aleph, Beis, Gimel, Yud, Taf, Tzadi, Kuf, Reish, Ayin, and so on and so forth. You have the whole thing here. So you say, what's the Baruch Shem Kavod Malchusai doing there? Exactly. The same way whenever we say Hashem's name, we're afraid maybe we didn't show it honor and therefore we want to praise it. We say Baruch Shem. The same way when we say the bracha on the tefillin Sharosh, we say Baruch Shem in case it's a bracha Vatala. Here we're saying the big Shem of Hashem, so in order, Chas v'Shalom, in case we didn't treat it with the proper honor, we say right after Baruch Shem. And we're going to talk about why it's mentioned in Kabbalah Shabbos. Because when do we, we're coming to that very soon. The Zohar HaKadosh says, in number 17, Tikkunei Zayar, Reb Shimon stood up on his legs, and he said, Riboin Almin, I raise my eyes to gaze in the heavens. Avai Bam! You want to come inside, you want to enter the highest realms, Bam! It's through the Shem Membeis, Bar Bam, Utrain Asvan, the Shema Mefarash. It's through the 42 letters, Laminda Kol Asva Oisal Tikkunei, to know exactly where every letter belongs. In fact, as Zohar HaKadosh says in Bereshis, with the 42 letters of Hashem's name, the world was consolidated and stood steady and stable. Comes the Kajin Tzamagid, and he says, what's Membeis? What's 42? Membeis is Rashi Tevais. Membeis stands for Masa Bereshis. That's exactly what the Mishnah means. We don't darshan Masa Bereshis in front of two people. What's Masa Bereshis? Membeis, the Shem Membeis. It's not just arbitrary. Membeis stands for Ma'aseh Bereshis. Hashem used the Shem Membeis to be able to create heaven and earth. And in fact, the Ramaz, Ramosha Zakuto, also says the same thing, that the Shem Membeis stands for Ma'aseh Bereshis. Now, let's get a little bit more specific. Because this Shem is a very important Shem. Because if you look in the Gemara in Kedushin, Daf Ayin Aleph, Amud Aleph, look at number 25, Amar Hidam Rav, the 42-letter name of Hashem, we only give it to someone who is a tsanua, and someone who's humble, and someone who is, middle-aged, and someone who doesn't get angry, and someone who doesn't get drunk, and someone who is not makbid on his kavod. But anyone who's zahir in this shame will be beloved up above, desired below, and he will inspire awe in people, and he will inherit Olam Hazeh and Olam Haba. So there's a special chashivos in understanding the Shem Membeis. So obviously, whatever we're going to learn tonight is only a te'ima sheba te'ima, is just a little bit of a flavor, but kalecha ve'echa lefi madregasai, whatever we're able to glean from it, to that degree, we should be ohav lamala v'nechmad lamata v'noichel Olam Hazeh v'Olam Haba. Oh, no, I didn't. So Yossi wants to know, so this whole Shiur, we're saying how you're not to talk about it, and it has to be for the Tsanuim, and it has to be, we don't, ein darshan ma'aseh bereshis b'fnei shnayim, so what are we doing? So here are the few justifications. So one is like this. There's a halacha in Hilchos Lashon Hara, that apei tlasa. What's apei tlasa? Even though you're not allowed to reveal information about somebody, you're not allowed to reveal Lashon Hara about somebody, but if 3 people know about it, you could assume everyone knows about it because Chavrecha Chaver Islam. So some Rishonim hold. Now the Chavetz Chaim paskins not to rely on it, but there is such a heter that once 3 people know about it already, then you're allowed to talk about it because you're not being megala anything because kfar yadua meforsa. So we could say the same thing over here. Avada you're not a darshan about because nobody knows anything about it, but Bizman hazeh, that it's in every single sefer, even simple svarim, already bring out the basic ideas of these shemos. Ad kedei kach, you could open up an English book and read about it. So you're not being megala anything. Now the fact that not everybody opens up every sefer, but it's very accessible and available today. That's one idea. I'll give you another illustration. The Ramban in Parshas Achrei Mois talks about the Sar Lazaza. And the Ramban says that this is a very mysterious thing, right? The Sar Lazazah, what in the world is the Sar Lazazah? And the Ibn Ezra gives like this cryptic comment, when you get to 33, you'll understand the Sar Lazazah. The Ramban comments on Ibn Ezra. He says, Rabbi Avram was Neman Ruach Mechased Davar. Rabbi Avram was a faithful man, and he covered over the matter. He didn't want to reveal the secret of the Sar Lazazah. Says Ramban, but I, Hoylech Rachel Megalaside. I'm going to be the Baal Lashon Hara who reveals the reason for the Sar Lazazah. Why? Says Ramban, Ki Kfar Giluhu Chazal. I'm not revealing anything. It's already found in Chazal. So you see that there's an idea that even when earlier authorities hid something, that's because nobody else knew about it. But once anyway it's out in the open, and anyone could know about it, and it's accessible, then you have license. In fact, the Zohar writes famously in Parshas Masei, this is one of the most famous Zohars. The Zohar says, and the Ramchal wrote a whole sefer on this line in the Zohar, Uvegin da'asidin Yisrael lemitam mehayilane dechaye ihu sefer Zohar HaKadosh Yipkun min galusa barachame. The Zohar says in the end of days, Klal Yisrael will taste from the taste of the Zohar, and we will be redeemed. What do you mean in the end of days we're going to taste from the Zohar? But it's not for everyone. But there's an idea at the end of days, more things become revealed, either through Sfarim that filter it down to us, and everything that we're learning today is pretty much out in the open in our times. Probably in our Zayda's times, this would only be, mamish l'tznuim, but we live in a time of terrible koyach hatuma, and v'zel u'mazeh asalekim. Even the Talmidei Hagra write about this idea, that Rabbi Yitzchak Isaac Chaver also says, in the end of days, things are going to become a little bit more revealed. Okay, be it as it may, we're going to learn now that the Shem Mem Beis consists of 7 words. Each word corresponds to a different day of the year. Do we ever have any shaychus to the Shem? Is there ever any tefillah that we say that touches on the Shem? The answer is yes. I'm sure many of you already know and are familiar that the tefillah of Ana B'Kayach, which was composed by a Tana, Reb Nechunya ben Akana, who is a great Mekubal, the tefillah Ana B'Kayach is a remez to the Shem Mem Beis, because each word of Ana B'Kayach stands for another letter. So Ana is Aleph, B'Kayach is Beis, Gedulas is Gimel, Yemincha is Yud, Tatir is Tatir Tzerura, right? Kabel Nasa Micha Sagve, right? So you say, really? How do we know Ana B'Kayach is so important? The main reason we know it's so important is because they don't even give you a chance to get, by the time you get up to Gedulas, they're ready, Lecha Doidi. So right, your mamish don't even have time to say it. That's how you know how important it is. In other words, in the whole davening of Marav Shabbos, what tefillah do they not give you a chance to say? The most important tefillah. Right? That's always a good barometer. In other words, how do you know how important Yom Porkin is? Because at that time, everyone is, it's between the Haftarah, and everyone's walking, and it's the only tefillah you ever say where you actually daven for your children. Zarachai v'kayama. So if you want to get, what is the Yetzer Hara out to get more than anything? Ana B'Chayach. That's why I like to say it out loud. And what are they going to do? They have to wait. Don't try it at home, But Ana B'Chayach, now, very important. By Kabbalah Shabbos, we stand up for Mizmar LeDavid. Yeah? Why do we stand up for Mizmar LeDavid? What's the inyan? Because in Mizmar LeDavid, you have Hashem's name, Yekevavke, 18 times. 18 times 4, 72. Mizmar LeDavid alludes to the 72 letter name of Hashem. Of course we have to stand for that. And then Ana B'Chayach is the 42 letter name of Hashem. And after that you say Baruch Shem, so you really should be standing for Ana B'Chayach. Again, this is in deference to the Shechina. Why Kabbalah Shabbos? Because in Kabbalah Shabbos is Yichud, Kutrabichu, Ushchinte. That's why at the end of Kabbalah Shabbos you turn to the Marav, Shechina b'Marav. So it's an allusion to all the different Shemois of Hashem. Marav Rabbi says the Arizal on the Shar HaKavana. We know during Tefillah you're experiencing different Olam. It's Olam HaAsiyah, Olam HaYitzira, Olam HaAtzilut. How do you climb up from one Olam to the next? Al Yedei the Shem Mem Beis. The Shem Mem Beis helps you fly from one world to the next. Question is, how? How does Ana B'Chayach help you fly? Basically, Ana B'Chayach helps you fly. Maybe if you say the Kavana, the airlines will get going again. You'll be able to go to Eretz Yisrael. Who knows? I mean, we just, I think, uncovered a school. In other words, how do we get air travel going? Maybe, this year we'll be ma'ira the inyan of Ana B'Chayach. Ana B'Chayach helps you soar. How? What is the connection between Ana B'Chayach and flying? Says Tikunei Zayar number 30, Mamish Dvar Ayumim. He says the tefillah of Ana B'Chayach and the 42-letter name of Hashem corresponds. Remember how many names are in it? 7. Each name has how many words? 6. The 6 words of each name correspond to the 6 wings of the Malachi Hasharis. How do I know the Malachi Hasharis have 6 wings? Look at number 31. In the Sefer Yeshaya, it says, this is the Haftarah of Yisroi, in the death of King Uziyahu, it says, I saw Hashem sitting on his throne, Srafim, Mimalai Sheish Kenafayim, Keish Kenafayim Liachad. Each Malach has 6 names. By the way, what does it say? 6 wings. What does it say on their wings? Baruch Shem Kavod Machosei Le'olam Va'ed. What do they do with their 6 wings? B'shtayim yichasef anav. With 2 wings, the Malachim cover their face. And with 2 wings, they cover their feet. And with 2 wings, they fly. So the tefillah of Ana B'Chayach and the 42-letter name of Hashem is the tefillah which allows you to soar from one madrega to the next. They cover their face in shame, in sneos. They cover their legs in sneos, and they fly. Marv Rabbi says Tikunei Zayar. Where else do we use the 42-letter name of Hashem? Does anybody know? How many times does Hashem's name appear in your tefillin? 21 Shemos in the tefillin shel Rosh. 21 Shemos in the tefillin shel Yad. 42. Keneged the Shem Mem Beis. It says Shvilei Pinchas. Maybe that's why we wear the tefillin during the tefillah. It helps be mala. The Arizal teaches that the segula of the 42-letter name of Hashem is mala the tefillahs. That's why we wear the tefillin. That's Ekya, Asher Ekya, 21. It's a 42-letter name of Hashem. Now, here's an important halacha. Is a person allowed to look at a cell phone wearing tefillin? L'chayra, you can't. L'chayra, it's a dairaisa. What are you talking about? That's extreme. Very pashut. What would you say if a Kohen Gadol, in the middle of the Avodah, took out a phone? So we know there's an Isser Daraisa to be Mesiach Das from the Tzitz. Why? Because the Tzitz has a Shem of Hashem. You know, the Gemara in Chulin says that Hesach Hadas from Tefillin is a Daraisa Kavachlimer from the Tzitz. That if the Tzitz only has one Shem of Hashem and you can't be Mesiach Das, Alachas Kama V'Kama, if you're wearing Tefillin, you can't be Mesiach Das. Marv Rabbi said, do you realize that how would we behave? Imagine if you were a Kohen Gadol wearing the tzitz. What kind of machshavos would you have? How would you act wearing the tzitz? The tefillin is much 40 times holier than the tzitz. It's a kal v'chomer in chulin. It's a din d'oraisa. It's not like a hiddur. You're not allowed to distract yourself wearing tefillin. Now, tefillah is not a distraction. But to look at something extraneous is something to think about. Anyway, Marv Rabbi Sai, the Arizal says like this. The 6 words of each of the again, Ana B'Chayach has what? 7 words. Each word has 6 letters. Each of the 6 letters corresponds to another wing of the Malachim. Now, Marv Rabbi Sai, it comes out amazing. Comes the Ari, and the Ari said the following teaching, and Reb Chaim Vital was masberit based on what we learned. That when you say Ana B'Chayach, you should say it like this. Ana B'Chayach, Gedulas Yemincha, Patir Tzurura, Kabel Rinas, Amcha Sagvenu, Tarenu. You stop after each 2 words. Why? Says Reb Chaim Vital, because since each of the 6 words correspond to the 6 wings. And the first 2 wings they cover their face. So that's one inyan, so it stands by itself. The 2 wings, they cover their feet. So it's one inyan, it stands by itself. With 2 wings, they fly, so it stands by itself. Therefore, says the Shlach HaKadosh, that Ana B'Chayach, you say it in Kriya Shema Alamita. For those who say Kriya Shema Lamita, now let me tell you a few things once we're on the subject. Because people, thank you. People get very scared by Kriya Shema Lamita because it's like 50 pages, And they say, forget it. So now you have to know, if you're getting too scared by Kriya Shema Lamita, just say the first parsha of Shema and Hamapil. That's the bare minimum. Even now, if you daven Marav before the Shkia, before the Tseis, you have to repeat all 3 parshios. But if you daven Marav 15 minutes after Shkia, what you're required to say is the first parsha of Shema and Hamapil. Hamapil is a very important bracha. It's one of the biggest skulas for Shalom Bayis. You know that? Now another skula for Shalom Bayis is a mask. Vayitin al panav masveh. It's also these are 2 big skulas for Shalom Bayis. Either Hamapil. So one thing you can do when you get home at 6 o'clock, say Hamapil, and usually you're good for the rest of the evening, right? But Hamapil is a bracha that you have to say. And you should say one pasuk of Rachamim. B'yadcha afkir ruchi padisa isi Hashem kelemes. It's a bracha, I believe, from the Anshe Knesset HaGdolah, like all the brachas. You're not supposed to, according to the Mishnah Berurah, you're not allowed to speak out. But according to Aruch HaShulchan, it's only a brichas hashvach. According to Aruch HaShulchan, being mafsik is not such a... The lamashal, let's say like this. Let's say you said Hamapil and your father calls you. So then you would answer. You would respond with Mea Kavod. Because there are shitos that Hamapil is brichas hashvach. Now, but there are other tefillos. One of the... What? Depends what she wants, right? She wants you to take out the garbage. You don't have to say anything. You can take it out. It's called the Chumash Hadeshan. That's the last avodah of the day. My grandfather used to take out the garbage when he was 97 years old. He wouldn't let anybody take it. He would say it's the last avodah of the Yom is the Chumash Hadeshan. But part of the Kriya Shema Lamita is Anu B'chayach, I believe. Why Anu B'chayach? Because since Anu B'chayach helps you fly, so it gives energy, it helps you fly up to the Shamayim without the Makachugim interfering. When else do you say Anu B'chayach? You do? That's when you fly to the moon, maybe. Right. When you're in a NASA spaceship, you say Anu B'chayach. I don't know, maybe, I think you say Anu B'chayach is in Karbanos, after Abba you have a Masader. When are you Shana Yom Kippur? Okay. And before the Chadoidi. So Anu B'chayach helps you fly from one level to the next. No. You don't have. No? After Sfira you say it. Or if, let's say, the rabbi is saying a drush and is going very slow and you want him to fly, you could quietly say Anu B'chayach to... No, I'm just joking. Okay. So you should say, the Shlach HaKadosh brings it in Kriya Shema Lamita, look in your Nusach, and Samach L'Patirasai. In the last moments, there's such an inyan Anu B'chayach. Marv Rabbi said, comes Orach Chaim HaKadosh. Orach Chaim HaKadosh says in this week's Parsha, what was the inyan of the 42 Masois that Klal Yisrael went through? Why the 42 Masois? So he says we know there's a concept that everywhere in the world there are sparks of Kedusha that got dispersed there from the time of the Chet of Adam HaRishon, and it's the avodah of mankind throughout history to gather in these Mitzotzah Shel Kedusha, and at all of these 42 locations we were able to gather various sparks of Kedusha. Comes the Ber Mayim Chaim. The Ber Mayim Chaim is the Siddur Shel Shabbos. And he says, why 42? Because the shame that's able to be mevarer Kedusha, to collect Kedusha, to suction up Kedusha, where it's been scattered, that is also the koyach of the shame, membez, amazing thing. Interesting, the Zohar teaches us that the Tefillah of Anu B'chayach and the 6 letters of each word, 2 of the words cover our face, that we should not be ashamed from our enemies should not be able to harm us. 2 of the words, we cover our feet, and we're protected by the Chet HaEgal. Now what does the Chet HaEgal have to do? If you look at Rashi in Yeshaya, Rashi says the legs of Malachim look like an Egal, so they cover their feet not to remind Hashem about the Cheder Egel. And with the other two feet, we fly out of Golus. It's very interesting. How do you get out of Golus? How do you get out of the Midbar? How do you get out of the Mitzrayim? You need the Shem Membeis. It is no coincidence, Rabbi said. Rabbeinu B'chai tells us a very important principle, that the same way Klal Yisrael left Mitzrayim with great nisim, Hashem will take Klal Yisrael out of Golus with great nisim. And the same way Hashem brought Makois on the world before He takes us out of Mitzrayim, Hashem will bring Makois on the Goyim before He takes us out of Golus. And the same way we traveled through a midbar and made 42 stops, Klal Yisrael will have 42 stops before we go into Eretz Yisrael, before Mashiach comes. The Bnei Yissaschar writes that all of these Parshios are specifically read at this time of the year, because the same way, what do we learn about in Pinchas and Parshas Masei? We learn about the distribution of Eretz Yisrael. This is the idea, this is the subject we want to read about this time of the year, the allocation and the distribution of Eretz Yisrael. So Rabbi Yisai, this year had tremendous hashgacha pratis, because we already did so far 41 Mar Makoimos, and lo and behold, the last Mar Makom number 42, is one little chiddush. And that is, we could say like this: just like the first time before we went into Eretz Yisrael, the only way we were able to be elevated out of the Golus of Mitzrayim into the Holy Land was through the 42 Masois. Because the 42 Masois, as we read from Agada Perka, represents the Shem Membeis, the only way to be Nisala out of Golus and fly into Eretz Yisrael. The Zohar says, with two of the wings you fly out of Golus. The only way to fly from Golus into Eretz Yisrael is with the Shem Membeis. Likewise, in order for the Geula to occur, we need to traverse another 42, and that is the 42 time segments of the 3 weeks, 21 days, 21 nights. Because the same way we only got out of Golus Mitzrayim al Yedei the Membeis Masois to get into Eretz Yisrael, we will only get to the Promised Land, which is Tisha B'Av, the day of the Leda of Mashiach, through the Shem Membeis, which is alluded to in the 21 days of the 3 weeks and the 21 nights in the 3 weeks. So we should taka bizoicha this week, which is the end of the Torah, which ends with the 42 Masois, the same way the Torah begins with the 42 letter name of Hashem. We should be zoicha al yedei this Shem Membeis, which is merames to the Shem of Anu B'Kayach, that the same way that got us into Eretz Yisrael ultimately, may this Zman of the Shana, may this Tekufa also be Nesa'ala Klal Yisrael, that we should be zoicha to the coming of Mashiach Tzidkenu, B'mher B'yameinu, Amen. Shkoyach everyone, Shkoyach. Yeah.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.